I'm Doug Wolfberg. Welcome to COVID Coding, what ambulance revenue cycle professionals need to know. Later on, you're going to be hearing from my colleagues Dan Pedersen and Chris Kelly as well. We'll be handing off parts of this presentation back and forth. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor from QuickMed Claims. And in a moment, you'll be hearing from Scott Powell from QuickMed. So we'd like to thank them for their sponsorship. Of course, before we get started, we're lawyers, so we got to give you the big disclaimer here that this is an educational event. This is not attorney-client privileged advice. Today's program is approved for 1.5 hours of mandatory Con Ed for NAC for both certified ambulance coders and certified ambulance compliance officers. And there is a certificate in the handout materials. And of course, you have to then enter your Con Ed credits into your profile on the NAC website. Here's what we're going to cover in today's program. We're going to talk about the CARES Stimulus Act payments. We're going to cover new CMS guidance on signatures. We're going to go through the new regulations on cover destinations and modifier guidance for the pandemic. We're going to talk about the new COVID-related ICD codes. Chris will talk about medical necessity, and then we're going to hit sort of a quick potpourri of some other issues. Now, as I mentioned, our sponsor today is QuickMed Claims. PWW has been privileged to work with QuickMed Claims for years and years. They're a very conscientious revenue cycle company. They've had impressive growth over the years, and I know that they provide services to many of you on the program today. We really appreciate their sponsorship, their support of PWW, the support of the industry, and it's really a privilege to welcome the CEO of QuickMed Claims, Scott Powell, to talk to you for just a few minutes.
Great. Thanks, Doug, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to those that are in the Central Time Zone. First, I want to echo Doug's sentiments and thank all of you for your service, being on the front lines every day. You know, we all know that every one of us is impacted in one way or another. And as a company focused solely on EMS, you know, we're really empathetic to all of our partners during these uncertain times. I know I'm preaching to the choir about COVID-19, you know, being such a fluid situation, and there's confusion and uncertainty around it, both clinically and operationally. We also know it's critical that we keep our partners informed as to what's impacting the industry on a regular basis. And QMC does that in a variety of formats, whether it's our educational bulletins, podcasts, webinars, group and one-on-one conversations. And that's really why we're happy to sponsor this PWW education session today. And we thank Doug and the PWW team for helping all of us better understand the current situations. So I look forward to hearing Doug and his team's perspective and the latest updates. So thanks again for taking the time to be here, and thank you again for all of your service. And if there's anything QuickMed Claims can do to help you, you know, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Doug.
Thank you, Scott. Now, I'd also like to take an opportunity just to let everybody know that PWW has started a new program called PWW Client Connect. This is a flat fee legal services program. So this replaces the hourly billing when you get a bill for every phone call and every email and every letter and all that stuff. This is unlimited emails, unlimited legal questions, unlimited correspondence, no hourly charges. The clock doesn't start when you call. So a lot of organizations have taken advantage of this, quite a few actually, across the country, because then anybody in the organization, a supervisor, a biller, a manager, a director, anybody who has a question can pick up the phone, give us a call without fear of running the clock. So you get unlimited emails, unlimited legal questions, unlimited correspondence, no hourly charges. We'll review contracts for you. And if you have other services that you need, like an audit, claims review, documentation training, you get discounts on those other kinds of services as well. If you want more information on that, you can see the web link here. Visit our website at pwwemslaw.com/client connect. Notice there's a little underline between client and connect, but you can also navigate to this page from our main website page. If you want more information, it's very quick and easy. You answer 3 or 4 questions, your organization, your email address, how many calls you handle a year or that you process a year, and submit it, and we get right back to you. So it's pretty easy, and it's definitely a program that folks across the country are now taking advantage of. Okay, with that, let's get into the meat of the program today. First thing we want to talk about is the CARES Act Relief Fund. So the CARES Act among other things, created a $100 billion, what we call the relief fund. Now, there's a first chunk of this, $30 billion in funding, that's going directly to Medicare providers and suppliers. The first round hit bank accounts on the 10th of April. The second round hit the 17th. So by now, CMS has said all ambulance services should have received their payments. If you have not received your payment, here is the hotline to check on the status of your fund payment. On our website, there's also a coronavirus resource page, and there's an FAQ, a frequently asked question, that has all the details on how to follow up with the contractor that's processing these payments. So here's the phone number. It's 866-569-3522 if you have not received your payment. Now, these funds were supposed to go directly into your bank account by electronic transfer, whatever account you get your Medicare money at. The notation on your deposit should say something like US HHS stimulus or HHS payment. And any Medicare enrolled provider and supplier that received any Medicare Part B fee-for-service payments last calendar year in 2019 are eligible for these payments. Now, the payments are made according to tax ID number. So this can trip some agencies up. So say, for instance, you're a county that has an ambulance service, but your county also runs a nursing home. All of your Medicare reimbursement goes into this formula if it's all billed under the same county tax ID number. So if you see a number that looks really out of whack, keep in mind, if your organization has other Medicare services, it's based on your total payment and not just for ambulance. Now, to quickly determine how much you should have gotten, take the total amount that you were paid in Medicare funds under Part B in 2019, calendar year 2019, multiply that by 0.06198. Now that comes out to roughly $62,000 for every $1 million of Medicare payment you got last year. You do not include your Medicare Advantage, your Part C payments in this calculation. Now, one common question is, do I have to pay the money back? No, these are grants, not loans. They do not have to be repaid. But folks, it is a federal program, and like any federal program, there's a catch. The big catch is you are required to agree to certain terms and conditions. Now, the terms and conditions for the relief fund payments are also on our coronavirus resource page. You can also find them on the HHS portal. The point we want to make is you got to read these terms and conditions carefully, okay? If you want this money, you agree to these terms and conditions. We're only going to cover a small piece of those terms and conditions. It's a 10-page document, and you have to read them carefully. Now, the website to sign the attestation agreeing to those terms and conditions is now live. This is the link, as you can see on your screen, and it says right on the site that you agree to the terms and conditions by signing the attestation. But even if you don't sign it, if you keep the money, you also are bound by the terms and conditions. If you read the terms and conditions, or you listen to what we're going to go over here shortly, and you just decide you don't want any part of this, you don't agree to these terms and conditions, you must give the funds back to HHS within 30 days of when they were paid to you. If you return those funds and do not sign the attestation, you are not bound by these terms and conditions that we're going to cover. If you keep the funds, you are bound even if you don't sign the attestation. Of course, if you sign the attestation, you're also bound. All right, let's go through what some of the key terms are. First, the recipient certifies that payment will only be used to prevent, prepare, or respond to coronavirus and shall reimburse the recipient only for healthcare related expenses or lost revenues that are attributable to coronavirus. Now, our take here, folks, is that that's a pretty wide berth as to what you can use these funds for. Keep track of the funds, right? Make sure that you can track that you had, increased overtime, increased costs for PPE. You had, you took taken a hit with revenues, of course. So you want to keep track that these, if you have providers who are off because of they're in quarantine, so you had to pay OT to other providers, right? There are some salary limitations in the document, but those don't really apply to EMS agencies that are paying for field staff. Now, you also certify that you will not use the payment to reimburse expenses that have been reimbursed by other sources, which is another one of the terms and conditions. Now, here's the one we're going to spend a few minutes on. We don't like to just read slides here to you folks, but you can see that this says the Secretary has concluded that the COVID-19 emergency has caused many providers to have capacity constraints. As a result, patients may not be able to get care from an in-network provider, and they may have to get care from an out-of-network provider. Here's where it gets interesting. Accordingly, for all care for a possible or actual case of COVID, recipient certifies that it will not seek to collect from the patient out-of-pocket expenses in an amount greater than what the patient would have otherwise been required to pay if care had been provided by an in-network recipient. Now, let's talk about some of these key terms. Now, folks, we know Medicare prohibits balance billing. What the government is trying to do here is rein in balance billing for all of your payers, right? Commercial and others. So they're saying if you want our money, you're going to agree to do this for all of your COVID-related claims. So let's look at a couple of these terms in more detail. So let's take the closer look. So first, this only applies to care for a possible or actual case of COVID-19. If it's a non-COVID patient, folks, these limitations on balance billing do not apply. Second, it says you won't seek to collect from the patient, so an amount in excess of the in-network cost sharing. So some of you have fought for years and continue to fight with out-of-network payers over the amount that they pay you, right? Well, here's our full charge. We don't have a contract, so we're not limited to your in-network. We want our full bill. Now, most plans won't pay you your full charge, but if you don't have a contract that says, I agree to accept this lesser rate, some providers do find the time and trouble to be worth it to keep hammering on those plans to pay more and pay more. This term and condition does not regulate what the plan has to pay you. So if you want to dig in and go after the plan and get them to pay more than just some in-network rate or whatever it is, you're free to do that. It only limits what you can charge to the patient, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Okay, the limit of what you can charge to the patient is out-of-pocket expenses that exceed the in-network cost sharing, okay? So it's important to remember we're only talking about the amounts that you bill to a patient for the out-of-pocket portion. Now, the limit is that it's an amount greater than what the patient would have paid if they had gotten care from an in-network provider. So this means you have to identify the in-network cost-sharing amounts. All right, so as you might have noticed already, throughout this webinar, we've been, putting sort of the official stuff in regular black text. And when we're giving you our spin, our take, our analysis, we're putting it in this red italics, PWW's take. So our take here is, first off, that this limitation applies only to COVID-19 patients, right? If it's a COVID-19 patient, you can still bill the patient, but the limit is the cost sharing amount that they would pay for an in-network service. You cannot bill that patient any more than what their cost sharing would be, again, if it was in-network. So it doesn't prohibit you from dropping a bill to the patient. It only limits the amount that you can charge to the patient if they are a COVID patient. So how do you find out what that cost sharing amount is for an in-network service? Well, first you can look at the EOB or the remittance advice. If that patient responsibility amount is not listed there, one of the things you can do is get your crews in the habit of checking the patient's insurance card. They can jot that information down on the PCR. They could even take a picture of the card that has that info on it, turn it in with the documentation, or you can always inquire with the payer. Now, again, as I mentioned a minute ago, this attestation, these terms and conditions, they don't regulate the amount that the plan must pay. Now, we think the practical reality is that most plans are going to pay the in-network amount. But these terms do not limit what the provider may bill to the plan or the amount you are required to accept from the plan. The only exception to that would be if you are in a state that has a law that limits what an out-of-network provider can receive from a payer. And some states have laws like that. Now, another important take here is that make sure your billers, folks, know how to spot one of these possible or actual COVID patients when they read the PCR. Your agency's medical director can help with guidelines. The CDC's guidance generally means patients with fever, cough, shortness of breath, certainly a patient with a confirmed positive COVID-19 test, a patient who has symptoms and says, oh, I was exposed to somebody who has COVID for sure, right? Those kinds of cases would be COVID related, but you're transporting a patient who was out doing yard work and twisted their ankle, has no COVID signs and symptoms, they're not subject to this balanced billing provision. Now, so when it comes to commercial insurers, folks, policies vary across the board. Some commercial insurers are implementing cost-sharing waivers and paying providers 100%, or at least 100% of in-network charges, for certain COVID-related services. This does vary by payer. We found a pretty good site. It's AHIP. It's the Organization of Health Insurance Plans. And this link that's on your slide has a pretty good summary of what the major commercial insurers across the country are doing in terms of their policies during the pandemic. So that's a good resource you might want to bookmark on your computer. Okay, I'm going to talk about signatures here for a few minutes before I turn it over to Dan. Now, when the pandemic started, we got a lot of questions from across the country about EMS agencies who were concerned about suspected or confirmed COVID patients using their ePCR devices to sign, to get the patient's signature. There's concerns about cross-contamination. Patients are concerned about touching a device that other patients may have touched. And CDC had issued guidance for EMS agencies during the pandemic. One of the guidance in that document says providers should complete the PCR after the trip, after the transport, and after the crew removes their PPE and performs hand hygiene. So even CDC, which is another government agency, says don't be putting these devices in front of patients. So we took these concerns, and others did too. AAA and some other groups and organizations went to CMS. We had a couple of calls with CMS ourselves. We had quite a few emails with them and raised these concerns on behalf of all the providers that we were hearing from across the country. So CMS just recently issued the following clarification. And I'll quote here, CMS will accept the signature of the ambulance provider or supplier's transport staff if that beneficiary or their authorized representative gives verbal consent. Documentation, your chart should note that that verbal consent was given. So our take on this is, if you think about it, this CMS guidance really creates something of a new category of assignment of benefits signature. So we all know the standard rule is that if the patient is physically or mentally capable, they sign. If they're not physically, mentally capable of signing, somebody signs on their behalf, and those are all the legal guardian, the representative payee, that kind of stuff. This is a new category because the patient is mentally capable of signing, but CMS is allowing them to give verbal consent to the provider to sign for them. So this is really a new category of signature. Now, we have created, folks, a COVID-19 specific version of our signature form, our ambulance signature form, that many services across the country are familiar with. Many use it, and many software suppliers and software developers across the country, and many of the programs that are used throughout the industry have also incorporated PWW signature form. Now, none of the vendors or software companies that we're aware of yet have taken what we're going to show you here in a minute and have yet put that into their PCR platforms. Some may not. But we're going to give you a way to be able to do this even if they don't incorporate this into their software. So we're going to go through briefly the changes we've made to our model signature form. Okay, so this signature form, folks, is in your handouts, in the program handouts. And it looks really exactly like the old signature form, except on the bottom right, you'll see a new box. It says for known or suspected COVID-19 patient only. You just check a box that the patient gave that verbal consent. Then the ambulance crew member signs their name, the crew member's name, not the patient's name. Crew shouldn't sign the patient's name. Prints their name and dates it. Everything else on this form is the same as our standard signature billing form, except we just rearranged a few things to make room for this new section. So as you can see, the language is the same. That box to the bottom right is the new COVID-19 specific signature box. Okay, so let's say you're still using the standard PWW signature form that doesn't have that COVID box on it, or you're using software that, is based on that and doesn't have the COVID specific signature box on it. We're going to give you a couple of ways that you can do that in your current signature screen or on your current signature form. Okay, here's one option. So if you're looking at the PWW sample form, right, the standard one, Section 1 is where the patient signs. One way you can do this is you can just write down patient gave verbal consent for crew to sign, right? Something just very simple. And then print the patient's name, write the word by, B-Y, and sign your name. The crew signs their name. So you can see on this example, we wrote the patient's name, John Smith, by Douglas Wolfberg, right? That's one way you can do it on the existing form. Another option that's just as good is on that signature line in Section 1, you can write verbal consent to sign or verbal consent given to crew. And then down on Section 2, where a representative signs, you can sign, the crew member can sign their name, right? And then print their name and all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't check any of those 4 boxes because an ambulance crew member is not one of those listed signers. But under this new guidance, that would be a perfectly valid place to sign as well. So that works too. Now, folks, for non-COVID patients, this signature guidance technically does not apply. Okay, the CMS guidance on this new signature option where the crew can sign if they have verbal consent is only for COVID-19 patients. But we saw this little gem of a sentence on HHS's website. HHS broadly views every patient as a possible case of COVID-19. Does that mean we can automatically assume that everybody is potentially COVID and use this new signature rule? Well, I think CMS was really speaking here more from a provider protection standpoint, infection control. We assume everybody's infectious. I really think it's probably best to just limit this new signature rule on verbal consent to patients who have symptoms of COVID, who are confirmed COVID, right? Or there's some clinical reason to suspect may be infected with COVID-19. I don't know that I feel really great about saying, yeah, just assume that you can apply this rule to every single patient. But you see the statement that HHS made on their website. You can take it for what it's worth. But for non-COVID patients, really the safest thing to do is to apply the standard signature rules, which you can see here. We don't need to re-review those because those standard rules have not changed. And remember, for a patient who is not physically or mentally capable of signing, Here is the list of authorized signers who can sign on their behalf. Folks, one last thing to remember is that CMS controls Medicare. So that new rule, that new interpretation, that new guidance applies to Medicare. It doesn't necessarily apply to Medicaid. It doesn't apply to commercial insurance. You've got to look to see if those payers have issued any kind of guidance with regard to signatures. Medicaid programs generally do require a signature. Commercial payers, may or may not, right? So you just have to look at what those payers require. And folks, always remember that your EMS documentation always has to be detailed and accurate, and it always has to explain the manifestations of the patient's COVID status. And as Chris is going to talk about when we get to medical necessity, we can't just write COVID-19 on a PCR and let that be our whole documentation, right? But any patient who can't sign, we always need to have the clinical reasons, right, why that patient is incapable of signing. Okay, folks, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Dan Pedersen, but once again, we'd like to thank and acknowledge the very kind sponsorship of our friends at QuickMed Claims. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dan.